And that is how you add the camera back in from Blender into After Effects. Yes! Smashed it. Wait, was this not even on? What's going on, guys? My name's Bruce, welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to show you how to export the 3D camera tracker from After Effects into Blender, create a basic scene in Blender, then export and compose that scene back in After Effects with a camera and empties from Blender. Bear with me on this one. Okay, so if you're anything like me, you like things nice and simple and want things to just work. Blender is an insanely powerful tool, but although good, its tracking system can be quite long and drawn out process sometimes. This is where the plugin AE2Blend comes in. And yes, this is a paid plugin, but it's honestly so cheap. And I think once you've understood this workflow, you will be satisfied with your investment. The plugin allows you to take the 3D camera data from After Effects and import it directly into Blender, along with any nulls or objects, solids that you've created as well. This process makes compositing CG elements into your footage so much easier, and it plays a huge part in how I created this tidal wave effect in an upcoming project. Hold it there for a second, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Instead, I'll use a demonstration of a giant Suzanne falling from the sky, which I stuck together in about 10 minutes, so don't judge me. Okay, so I'll start off with a clip I want to use in my timeline, and I've already found the part I want to use. This footage was shot at 120 frames per second, and I've interpreted it to 23.976 frames per second, hence why it's slow motion. Go to Effects and look up the 3D camera tracker and apply it to your footage. Once it's done, select the points where you want your plane to be, right click and select Set Ground Plane and Origin. Now this is really important. If you don't do this, when you import your camera and plane into Blender, they'll be off into the distance somewhere and it will make your life so much harder when you build your scene out. Trust me, do not skip this step. Next, right click on those same points again and select Create Solid and Camera. I'll rename the plane to Ground Plane to keep things organized. Scrub through your timeline and make sure the plane is sticking to the floor as it should and throughout the whole footage. Now, open up Blender and delete everything. You need to make sure you have the AE2Blend add-on enabled. Like I said, it's a paid plugin, so you need to download it first and then install it. Okay, so before we import anything, you'll need to make sure your Blender scene is the same frame rate as your footage. I already know my footage is 23.976, so I can set my Blender scene to that frame rate. Now let's hop back into After Effects and drop down the transform options on the camera. Highlight both the position and orientation of the camera, then hit Ctrl+C to copy, Command+C on a Mac I believe. Then go back into Blender and click the Create Camera button. You will then see a newly imported camera plus its corresponding keyframes. Now my next really important tip is to check where your keyframes start. My footage is 250 frames long and my Blender scene is 250 frames long. However, my footage in After Effects starts at frame 1, but Blender is starting my animation at frame 0. Therefore, you'll need to highlight all the keyframes and drag them along one frame, else your animation will be offset by +1 frame and would throw off the whole alignment. If we go back and check now, the animation in both After Effects and Blender are the same. Okay, now go back into After Effects, highlight these 4 parameters on the solid, copy, then hop back into Blender and select Create Plane. Now you have both your solid and your camera in the scene. If you hit 0 and go into the camera view, you can see the camera moving around the plane. Take note though, the plane is in the center of the scene because we set the origin point in After Effects earlier. The problem you have now though is it's at a weird angle, which will become an issue when you start building out your scene. I need to orient the plane so it's on the global axis, but I need the camera to follow also. To do this, select the plane, press Shift S and choose Cursor to Selected. Now come up to Transformation Orientation, click the plus icon and give it a name. The transformation orientation is now set to the plane. Now add an empty, go to Object, Transform and select Aligned Transform Orientation. This will put your empty in the same orientation as the plane. Now you need to parent both the camera's empty and the plane's empty to the newly created empty. Do you know what, just something like off script at the moment, this like lingo in Blender is mad, like it hurts my head. So if you're getting lost with any of this and you're struggling, you're not the only one because bruv, that's long, like hard sometimes. Anyway, let's carry on. To do this, click and drag select all the empties. The one you just made should be the active object in yellow. If it's not, then hold Ctrl and click on it until it turns yellow. Now hit Ctrl P and select Parent Keep Transform. You may want to rename this one to World or something. Now with your empty selected, change the transformation orientation back to global, go up to Object, Transform and Aligned Transform Orientation. That should now align both the plane and the camera on the global axis. Next, we need to add in our video so it plays in our camera. Go down to the camera settings and enable background images. You can use a still image, a sequence of images, or a movie clip. Now your original footage file will have a different amount of frames than the footage in your composition. You can use this, but you'll need to work out how many frames to offset your footage by so it matches up. To make your life easier, I'd recommend exporting the actual clip from your After Effects composition and using that as a reference. Find that file in your Explorer and import it into your camera. Now just scrub through the timeline to check it lines up. One thing you'll notice is that something's off compared to the version in After Effects. This leads me on to my next important tip and one of the biggest mistakes I see people make with this plugin. The camera inside of After Effects and Blender both have to be exactly the same. If they're not, then you'll have two different perspectives. To make sure they match up, double click the camera inside of After Effects and copy the focal length, then paste that into the focal length of the camera in Blender. Make sure you check the sensor size too, although they're usually both set to 36mm. So now we want to set up our scene scale. The way I like to do this is I like to estimate how long I think this plane is. For my scene, I'm going to say around 1 meter. So I'll add a cube and scale it to be exactly 1 meter in diameter. I'll then select my world empty and scale that until the plane matches up with the cube. Now just delete the cube as we don't need it anymore. The scene is now set up and ready to go. I'll start by scaling my plane so it matches the scene. I'll also extrude the right side so it lines up with this railing. Switch your background image to front if you need help aligning your mesh. I'll then add in Suzanne, rotate her and position her out of frame. I'll also give her a subdivision surface modifier and I'll set her shading type to smooth. I need to make both Suzanne and the floor rigid bodies. Suzanne will be active and the floor will be passive. This isn't a physics tutorial by the way, so I'll assume you already know what I'm talking about. I'll also set both objects' collision shape to mesh and I'll give Suzanne a weight of 100 kg. Okay, so I shot this at 120 frames per second and slowed it down to 23.976. As a percentage, that works out to 20% of the original speed. Therefore, I need to make sure my physics are playing at a 20% speed to make it more realistic. To do this, go into Rigid Body World and under Speed, I should enter 0.2 to get 20%. However, and yes I know I like to be difficult, my friend Gaz, who is running in this scene, is already pretending to run in slow motion anyway. I wanted to create some super slow motion, but my camera only shoots up to 120 frames a second, so I had to fake it. Given the fact I don't actually know what speed this would realistically be, I had to play around until I got something that I liked. But a quick tip, if you're using physics and slow motion, adjust your physics speed to match the percentage your footage has been slowed down by. So for example, 50% would be 0.5. Now under Cache, hit Bake and let's play this back. It's not great, but it will do for this demonstration. I'll quickly set up my world and materials. Firstly, go to Render Engine and change it to Cycles GPU Compute. I'll then add in a 360 photo that I took on my phone using the Google Street View app. I'll leave a link down in the description. I already know what colour I'm grading this footage, so I've pre-graded the environment photo in Photoshop beforehand. I'll then go into Rendered View, hit Ctrl T on the image node and rotate the environment so it matches up with my scene. This is crucial to make sure the lighting and reflections are accurate. For Suzanne, I'll give her a simple red glass shader. I'll then make the floor and railing a shadow catcher. Make sure to check transparent under film in render settings. You can also add in motion blur if you want. Set the amount of samples you want to use, then choose the output file path and file type. I'll be using PNG files. If you do and you want transparency, make sure you're exporting them with Alpha. Go back into After Effects, go to File, Import, then select File. Locate your output folder, select the first image and then click Import. This will import the whole folder contents as a sequence. But my next important tip, After Effects is default import sequences at 30 frames a second. So dragging this clip as it is into the comp would be a complete mismatch and nothing would line up. So right click the file, go down to Interpret Footage and select Main. Here you can change the frame rate After Effects will play this file back. So in my case, 23.976 frames per second. Now you can drag this file into your composition and it should match up perfectly. Okay, so I've got my sequence in and it matches up with my footage. But now let's say I want to add in some fire to Suzanne and I don't want to mess around with Blender's smoke simulation. I could go into the tracker in After Effects and add a point on Suzanne, then import some green screen fire, but there's a much easier and accurate way to do it. So let's go back into Blender, select Suzanne and tab into edit mode. Press Alt-A to unselect everything. Using the vertex select a vertex in the position you want to track. Then press Shift-S and choose Cursor to Selected. Now, tab out of edit mode, press Shift-A and add an empty. Let's rename this empty to mouth. You'll need to orient this empty so it matches up with Suzanne, so like before, select Suzanne, go up to Transformation Orientation and click the plus icon. Now select your empty, go to Object, Transform, Align to Transform Orientation. Then go back to Transformation Orientation and set it back to Global. Now with the empty selected, shift select Suzanne and press Ctrl P to parent. You want to choose Object, Keep Transform. Now if you scrub through the timeline, you'll see that the empty follows her mouth. To export this information into After Effects, you'll need to enable an add-on that comes with Blender. Go up to Preferences and search for Export Adobe After Effects.jsx. Enable this add-on and close the preferences. If you can't find it, then I'll leave a link in the description where you can download the add-on for the version of Blender I'm using, which is version 2.9. Now select just the empty you want to export, go up to File, Export, Adobe After Effects.jsx and save that file in your project folder. Make sure all of these options on the right hand side are checked. Bear in mind though, if your scene is quite large, this can take a while. Back in After Effects, go up to File, Scripts, Run Script File and locate that JSX file. This will import any empties you selected, the active camera and put them into a new composition. I just leave the default name as it is as I don't use this composition. Now go into your original composition, turn off the visibility for the camera, the plane and hide them both in the layers panel. This will save you from getting confused as we're now going to import a second camera into the composition. Now open up the blend comp, select everything inside of it, hit Ctrl C, then go to your main comp and hit Ctrl V. Now you have a new camera and a null that tracks perfectly to Suzanne's mouth with the correct position, orientation and scale keyframes. Okay, so the next part can be done in lots of different ways. This is just the way that I like to do it, and if you prefer this method then feel free to use it. I want to add some fire to Suzanne's mouth. I've downloaded some footage that I got from Production Crate and that's already been keyed out. Plus it's been shot in slow motion so it matches my scene much better. I'll drag this clip into my composition, then find the part of the clip that I want to use. Then I'll just make it a 3D layer. Then go to the first frame and copy the position, scale and orientation of my new null onto that fire clip. This will create a bunch of keyframes on my footage, but I don't actually want these. So select all the keyframes and hit delete. The footage is now in the exact same location, rotation and scale as the null, but it's not parented to it yet. To do this, take the pick whip and drag it from your footage onto the null. Now scrub through the timeline and make sure the fire tracks to Suzanne. As the empty was imported facing down, simply rotate your footage until it's the correct way up. You may need to also reduce its scale quite a bit. Now the layer uses its anchor point for the position. As the anchor point is in the middle of our footage, I'll need to move the layer up on the y-axis so the fire lines up with Suzanne's mouth. Then scrub through the timeline just to make sure it matches up. As this is a 3D layer, you can also turn on motion blur if you want. Then after some simple tweaks, basic color grade and a few alterations, you get something like this. Woo! Wow. We got there in the end, didn't we? Now, if you followed all these steps and you're not getting the same results, then firstly, remember the important tips that I gave. Number 1, set your ground plane and origin in After Effects before you export the camera to Blender. Number 2, set your scene frame rate in Blender to the same as your footage. Number 3, make sure your camera animation starts at frame 1 in Blender. If it starts at 0, highlight all the keyframes and move them over by 1 frame. Number 4, make sure the focal length and sensor size of the cameras are the same. This is the one that a lot of people forget. And number 5, once you've imported your sequence into After Effects, make sure you interpret its frame rate to match with your original footage. If you're still having issues, then check what version of the software you are using. I'm using version 1.3 of the AE2Blend plugin, which is the newest version available at the time of this video. I'll put the versions of After Effects and Blender that I'm using on the screen here. I'm not sure what version of Blender or After Effects this plugin is actually compatible with, but I usually like to stick with older versions of the software as I have a lot of plugins and they take time to get updated. You can always check the plugin documentation on the Blender Market website. I'll leave a link down in the description. And that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below. I'll leave a link to the plugin I use in the description, and I'll also link the footage I use so you can have a go yourself. But thanks anyway, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.